All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sent Conference Online. This year, we are pivoting again, just like everyone else has had to do, and are switching from doing a weekend conference, which is what we did last year, and are instead spending four Wednesday evenings in November doing it online instead. My name is Jenna Fabiano. I am one of the pastors at Willoughby Church in Langley, BC, and I'm joined tonight by Dave Groon, who is one of the pastors at Hope Community Church in Surrey. We both serve on what's called the Home Missions Committee, and if you are unfamiliar with that, it is a committee that's affiliated with the Christian Reformed denomination. And it was out of that committee that this whole conference was sort of birthed. So just to give you a little bit of background, the Send Conference was created last year as a way of dialoguing about mission and about participating with the Holy Spirit in God's mission, particularly in this area of the world. And we wanted to be able to start conversations and foster conversations to foster a little bit more of a missional DNA within our local churches. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to focus on the topic of missional engagement specifically, and invite 4 key ministry leaders to dialogue with us about this. And each of them have picked a particular niche within this topic that they're going to briefly speak about each evening. And then most of the evening will be spent dialoguing with them, asking questions, and fielding questions from you guys as well. So you'll notice if you're watching live on YouTube right now, that there's a little chat box on the right-hand side. At any point in the evening, you can write a little question in there and we'll be fielding those later on. So tonight we are very privileged and honored to be able to have Aaron Baart with us as our keynote speaker, the one we are interviewing. And I'll let him introduce himself in a few minutes here, but for now, I'll pass it to you, Dave.
Yeah, I'm also very grateful, Aaron, that you can join us. I feel like we're in a moment where everyone's really focused on the pandemic. And I feel like your conversation tonight just widens the lens of what God is doing around the world and how the gospel's on the move in places that we often don't think about. And so we really appreciate what you're going to share with us tonight. But what I'd like to do before we even begin is just hold this evening in prayer. So would you join me in prayer? Father, we thank you that you guide your church and that you love your church. And tonight we ask that you would open our eyes to see what you are doing around the world, and that you would encourage us. Lord, we thank you for our brothers and sisters around the world, for their faith, for their love, for their perseverance in persecution, for their faithfulness in different contexts. And Lord, we pray that tonight we would enter this conversation as learners, and that you would impart wisdom on us, that we would be more faithful in the very places you have us right now. To that end, we pray that you would fill Aaron with your Holy Spirit, and that this conversation would bring pleasing and glory to you. Amen. Well, Aaron, I'd like to start just by asking you to share with us a little bit about yourself, what you've been up to in God's kingdom for the last 10 years, and what's made you want to share this topic with us tonight.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you so much for being invited into this conversation. It's fun to connect with a whole lot of fellow British Columbians. Home is near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Greater Vancouver. Finished my undergrad here at Dordt University in Sioux Center, Iowa, where I live now. Came back and went through seminary at Regent in Vancouver, and was part of Home Missions and the British Columbia Christian Reformed Churches, serving a church plant in Chilliwack called Heartland Fellowship at the time. So got to do that for a few years, and then spent 6 years as a church planter back here in Iowa. And the last 10 years now, I've been serving as Dean of Chapel and now also Chief of Staff at Dordt University. But alongside all of this, just have gotten introduced to a much larger missional community. Like, I went to seminary to become a church planter, to learn how to do these things. And yet throughout this journey have been introduced to international personalities who are way better at this than I ever was and ever will be. And I love that idea. And so trying to connect with the places right now in the world where, the vapor trails of the Holy Spirit are burning the brightest. And there's just a lot going on. I think we focus so much these days on a decreasing church in the West, a lot of drift. I have conversations at university all the time with parents and grandparents who are worried about their kids not staying in the faith. And I've just found so much perspective from the global church. And currently spearheading a grant that we got for a rather large video project we're doing for churches all around North America called Missions Upside Down. And so I'm hoping to talk to you guys a little bit tonight just about that and kind of reframing how we think about missions in terms of the refugee, the immigrant in the West, and also just what we can learn from people elsewhere in the world who are doing this so well.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. So your session tonight, to follow up with that, is called Missions Upside Down, Acknowledging the Heart of the Global Church Moving South. So can you tell us then, expound on that? What made you want to speak on this? Well, you kind of already shared that a little bit, but what makes this particular topic so important for the church today?
Yeah, I guess I was struck in a moment where I found it really, really ironic that this person that I had met and connected with overseas, and my wife and I co-founded a church planting organization in Liberia, West Africa, 13 years ago, and found from the leaders there, all the models that they were using for church planting had nothing to do with what I was taught in the West. And in fact, we would have regarded them as very terrible models for church planting. And while I've had the privilege of getting to be part of two, I guess by all North American standards, successful church plants in the West, have found partners in West Africa who are planting churches at ridiculous rates. And so, I spent 9 years being a part of 2 church plants in North America. And in 13 years now, I've been part of 31 church plants in Africa, and realizing, it's just been this absolute strike of humility, I think, for us to realize we have so much to learn from the places that are burning the brightest. And if I may, can I just do a screen share with you guys? And I'll share a little bit about that story and sort of where that comes from. And let's see. You guys will have to tell me if this is working properly, okay?
Looks like it.
All right, are we on board?
Yep, we're good.
Awesome. Okay, so the organization we work with and my wife and I created is called One Body, One Hope. And this is what has taught me, and this is what we kind of call our accidental ministry. Nothing we ever sought to create or woke up one day thinking, hey, let's get involved in international missions. But in the process of adopting one of our sons, our middle son, Judah, from Ethiopia, I was staying in a ministry guest house with a pastor there from Liberia, and we hit it off, became really good friends really quickly, and just agreed to stay in touch. And I think often when you travel, you meet people and you say stuff like that, and then it all falls apart when you get home. But there was something so compelling about these guys, and I realized, man, this person is the same age as me, has the same amount of kids as me, always dreamed about being a church planter like me. And the difference is I live in the richest English-speaking place in the world, and he lives in the poorest. And that was one of the biggest differences we could find between us. So we started introducing these ideas that they wanted to engage in. And I fell headlong for it. On a recent trip where I went, you can see that I realized through study that this window of sub-Saharan Africa in the last 100 years has been the hottest movement of Christianity since its inception in terms of overall growth. So within the sub-Saharan African window, at the turn of the 20th century, there were a very minimal amount of Christians. Today, there are 250 million inside this window. And it just hit me in a moment while I was standing there and we were filming, thinking to myself, I'm standing on this red dirt, and this is the reddest, hottest place of spirit growth in the history of the Christian movement. And this place that is so poor, in fact, where we were at the time in Liberia, the poorest country in the world, is phenomenal at doing this with zero resources, just really, really leaning into where God was leading them. And their churches at the time were all being built out of collecting Civil War orphans. So pastors were going through the street, moved by the gospel, finding children clinging to dead bodies of parents, and just realized that I have to take these people in. And it struck me in the conversations back with them too. It's just that's a terrible church planting model. Orphans are very dependent. I think we get the most excited when a rich person comes in our church thinking, man, this is going to be the catalyst that's going to move us. Or we look for that personality of the evangelist. And they were just following very, very simple gospel motives. We come across someone less fortunate than us, even though we are the most unfortunate people in the world financially, take them in, and they built churches out of collecting orphans. But somehow through that process, God really made them the center of their community. And what they were doing was striking to their neighbors as well. And this notion of, are you the absolute best news happening to your community and the people around you, was enough to draw people within their communities to start gathering around these homes that they were founding with 60, 70 kids living with one pastor and his wife. This is the man who I got introduced to, who I would regard as my hero of church planting, Emmanuel Bimba. He's the one in the last 7 years now who's planted 31 churches. We've got another 10 in the works this year together. Doing that with very, very little resources, but just a compelling vision, a heart for the gospel, and a desire to transform their communities. So, back in history, when you would see a community in the West being developed, and even just physically the church being the epicenter of a community, so much of that has changed in our communities today. But they've really recaptured the essence of that. And in every community they go into, they sort of find the deepest felt need in that place and just become it. So a real notion of incarnational ministry. If the community is struggling with food security, they build a farm. If it's a clean water source, they dig a well. And everybody who needs those things comes to the church, and then they dwell there, they hang out there, they establish relationships, and they provide for the deepest needs of people. And it's just had me thinking, man, if I had to go back and ever do this again in North America, whether it's an interpersonal evangelistic conversation or whether it's an actual institutional church plant, thinking in an incarnational ministry sense, in the same way that Christ himself came and now his church comes in these places in the world, is what does this community need? And are we willing to become it? I can't see everybody who's on this call. I remember I was serving as a youth pastor at Fleetwood CRC in 2001. And we were surveying our whole community about what was going to be needed in this new building project we were going to do. And I was getting all excited because so many people from the community were asking for basketball hoops and playground stuff for their kids. And I thought, man, this is our church's moment. We're going to be this new presence in the community. We're right beside a school. This could be incredible. And over time, I think some of our own fears sort of kicked in, and the first graffiti showed up on the new building, and people wanted to protect their investment. And then the gates went up at the end of the parking lot. And it sort of, these walls started to go up. And so instead of a sense of invitation, it sort of became a sense of keeping others out as opposed to inviting them in. And we never built those basketball hoops. We never put in that playground. And through one reason or another, ended up getting invited in the community in Chilliwack and was there for the next little while. And I'm not trying to pick on Fleetwood at the time, because I think every single church struggles with this. Today, we have security guards in my parking lot, the church I'm at in Sioux Center, Iowa. Where people leave their keys in their car and nobody locks their doors to their houses, but we have security guards because we're worried about us. And this global pandemic moment, I think, has everybody tunneling in on themselves. And a gospel that was intended to be other directed becomes severely compromised, I believe, in times like this. And so our need to look beyond ourselves is probably more important now than ever before. And with reckless abandon, I've watched Emmanuel do that. And he's just been so inspiring to me. He was evangelized by a missionary in an incredibly remote village in high school, or what would have been the age of high school, but he never got to begin kindergarten until 22 years old. We've gone on a journey together through education. His Greek and Hebrew is now better than mine. But he sat in a kindergarten classroom at 22 years old, starting his education after being a refugee through a 16-year civil war. And after hearing those things, there's just a simple, different degree of perspective on life that has been truly transformative for me. So on our most recent trip, I went with Mark Volkers, who's in this picture, with a little girl there assisting through our ministry. Mark teaches digital media at Dordt and worked for years for Resonate Global, all through Africa, filming, telling the story of missional communities. And we got this grant together to take some of our students, connect in Liberia, India, Europe, Mexico, and looking at different ministries who are all the most effective at raising Indigenous leaders, finding people who are deeply influential within their own community, and then working with them. So this project is called Missions Upside Down. We were supposed to have it all completed in October, and we're supposed to have spent this past summer traveling all over the globe. And of course, COVID shut that down, or at least paused it. So hopefully we'll be able to complete that this coming summer and then be able to get that out. But it was fascinating to us just listening to the stories of how these people viewed mission, right? When they had no resources, their radio ministry took off during the Ebola crisis. And I've found them to be masterful at finding crisis moments as the most critical for missional opportunities. When Ebola struck and everybody was confined to their own homes, and many people there described it, this was the global epicenter, of course, of Ebola in Liberia. 10,000 people died. And they couldn't touch their own family members for months at a time. They couldn't hug, they couldn't connect. And Pastor Emmanuel just said, Aaron, you've got to get me on the radio. People are locked in. They're so starved for the gospel. This is the moment for our church. So here's this little guy who way late went through school, collected a bunch of orphans, hops on the radio to tell the story, and suddenly has 6 million weekly listeners to his radio program, and becomes a national influencer on the church scene because he's doing this so differently. And yeah, so like my challenge right now, think about like our own churches, where we're at. How opportunistic are we being in the middle of crisis situations, and how creative are we thinking about that when it comes to how we reach other people? The last 2 years, I've been struck over and over again that in Pentecost, not only is there sort of this revelation of the languages and the speaking in tongues that happens, and people from all different known places in the world all hearing the Spirit in their own voice, but the very next thing that happens is Peter stands up to explain this moment in Acts chapter 2, is that people will see visions and dream dreams, and basically goes on to explain the first thing that the Holy Spirit does is that he expands our imagination. And that's really been my prayer for the church right now in this season is, and I'd like to challenge everybody kind of in on this tonight, thinking like we're all just trying to hang on in this moment, but the best ideas and the greatest growth for the church has always come out of persecution, critical moments, hardship, and its greatest explosions. They just really embrace that as part of their worldview. And I realize that to a large extent, we really haven't. We haven't embraced that same mentality. So we got to go through with these students and connect with these guys in all these places. And this is one of my favorite pictures I took of Jake Brower on our trip with us, who does our digital media stuff on campus, because he had this little caption running with it of, best smile in the world, who wore it better? And these guys seem to be better at everything than us, and just really, really teaching us humility through that process. There's a principal of our high school there. We've got 6 Christian schools we got going. His name's Derek Dennis, gone through incredible hardship. The first Liberian student at Dordt University is going through our grad program right now in education, and just a phenomenal young man. We've got to take students. This is a bridge that our student engineers built as a senior design project to connect a farm. And these pastors, so for the last 4 years, we've been working with Timothy Leadership Materials, custom designed in a West African context. And a retired pastor in our area has been going and working with, these are 5 of our 40 some pastors there. Many of them with primary grade education, but so hungry for gospel learning and so effective as pastors that I think all the things that we think we need as a church in order to be effective in a missional context, or even as individuals in evangelistic conversations, I think need to be rethought. Our most effective church planter within our organization is actually the woman in the middle, Fatou. They've taught me that all their rules go out the window. This is a deeply conservative culture. One day we were on a road trip, flat tires, side of the road, and I asked Emmanuel, how did you let Fatu as one of your pastors? Like, you guys don't even believe in women in office. Like, how did that happen? And his response was like, I don't know, God did it. Like, there were no rules. If God has to move somewhere, they don't have a whole lot of barriers and red tape to be able to move. Their church is very light on its feet. And when an opportunity strikes, they just simply move and follow those prompts. And I try to imagine my structure in the Christian Reformed Church being able to pull off church plants that quickly, because God had something in mind. And we'd have a lot of bureaucratic red tape we'd have to get through before pulling that off. And so on this last trip, Fatu actually pastors at a church about 7 hours outside the capital, and it was her dream that we would come see it. And we got to go do that and took that picture in this place. And it's one of the sweetest humans I've met. This is our pastor, Dan DeGroat, from our area, who does all of our pastor training and goes for a month every year. Took a lifetime of wisdom in ministry and is using that in his retirement. Hospitalized right now with COVID, actually, but hoping we get him back to full health soon. And on this last trip, Dan and I went, and when he finished his teaching, he said, I don't know how many years I got left. All these pastors have always wanted me to see their churches and what they've been doing. And so he said, I just want to go with you, and we need to wash their feet and then hop in a car and go let them show us all their churches and where their ministry contexts are. And so that's what we did together next. Just got together and with all these pastors, had a ceremony of commissioning for them, washed their feet. And it was interesting walking away from it, because our students at Dordt all told us afterwards, I asked them, what was so moving to you? What was so striking? And I didn't even think about it at the time, but they said, it was so striking to see white hands washing black feet. And that wasn't the point of what we had set out to do in any way, shape, or form. But I just realized, like, through their eyes, how incredible it was, and how condescending I think so much of our missional frameworks typically are, that we're coming to bring something to people who don't have what we have, whether that's wealth and resources or whether it's a gospel message, as opposed to assuming, rightly so, that God is moving in this place. And I'm not coming so much as a missionary as a tour guide with eyes wide open to see where God might be moving. So they took us on these adventures, and we got stuck all over the place and took hours upon hours. And these creative and ingenuitive church planters, who, when we got stuck, didn't even have a tow rope with us. I thought we were just kind of going to be there until help came, and they hopped in the back seat with a pocket knife and cut out the seat belts and put together a tow rope by tying seat belts together that they cut out of the vehicle. And I just thought, man alive, I don't know many North American pastors who would think like this in a crisis situation. You just take what you have, you make do, and you get there. And, I've spent so much time in COVID feeling sorry for myself, like so many other people have. And for them, it was just, nothing's going to stop us. So this picture's kind of become, really imprinted in my memory as a framework for thinking outside the box. The furthest church we got to was this one, and I'll finish the screen share with this. And this is the first church that ever went up in the history of humanity in this community. And these people were so excited, and they were so proud of this structure for us to come and see it and show it to us. The whole community came out, broke out in song and dance for an extended period of time. And I've just found it's been so refreshing to my soul to connect with the tip of the spear of the gospel in Liberia, where there are still 75,000 completely unreached people. And the lessons that I've learned and how I've rethought about, man alive, if I ever went back to church planting, I would do this so different because of what I've learned from the poorest Christians in the world. And it's been really moving. And so that's kind of why we call this Missions Upside Down. Going out to these places and finding these spots and realizing through this research too, that as I ride on the back of dirt bikes through little villages like this, it might actually be the people here that are the backbone and the future of my own children and grandchildren's faith. As missions is starting to move back from where the heart of a Christian church is today in the global South, back to Europe and re-evangelizing Europe and re-evangelizing North America. Some of the fastest growing churches here in the US and throughout European capitals are from African and Asian missionaries who are first generation Christians coming back to re-evangelize. So our next stop on our filming tour is going back to where Christopher Columbus was commissioned at the Alhambra in Spain to leave and then realize that the churches being built here now are generations later the same people who they reached at the ends of the earth now coming back. So that concentric circle and the vision that's cast at the beginning of Acts, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, is actually moving back now from concentric circles back to where it's waning the greatest, and that being in the West. So a little bit of a kind of longer ramble there telling our story of how that works and why I'm as excited about this idea as I am. One last thought on that too, you know, as we look at the places around us and we look for the people that we want to be able to reach, I have been so disheartened by Christian conversations here in the United States about security of borders, about fears of the other, of refugees and immigrants. But statistically speaking, 90% of all refugees and immigrants who come to this country either are or will be Christians within the first 10 years of being here. I don't know the exact statistics in Canada. I don't think it's actually that much different, that the highest percentage rate of conversion to Christianity is in first generation immigrants. And so people that we often wouldn't imagine being the future of our churches might actually be the future of Christianity itself. I just think that calls for some reframing for us.
Absolutely. Aaron, you gave us so much right there. That was just a powerhouse of widening the scope. I have to say some of those images were absolutely stunning to me. The image of, you know, white hands washing black feet. And I think the reason it's beautiful is because we've often thought in the West that we have so much to teach, so much to give. And I think there is a necessary humbling season ahead of us. And recognizing, I mean, even in our own city, there's a church planting institution that was looking at some of the greatest areas of need. And it was in our own backyard here in British Columbia. Like, they're looking around the world at where is the greatest need, and it's our own cities. And we're like, okay, that's super humbling. But I want to talk a bit about, I feel like this swinging pendulum. I think many of us who grew up in the church remember praying for missionaries, commissioning missionaries. Our families wrote to missionaries. There was some sense of being connected to a wider body. And with all the blessings that have come with the missional church movement and thinking locally, I feel more and more somehow like Western churches are disengaged from the global church. And from the news we read to the conversations we have to the way we structure and think about church, we're just so disconnected from so much of what you just shared. How do we recover that sense of being part of a global body? And I mean, maybe you can even speak autobiographically about that as an American Christian, very involved in the global church. So talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, one way that we've learned to think about it by learning from our African partners is when we asked them, what is it you really want from the Western church? They didn't want money and resources. They just wanted to share and do life together. So it was just as simple as connecting with people in the most basic parts of life. For the first time ever, I led a mission trip and just told our partners there, you guys write the whole itinerary. Like, I don't even care what we do. It's up to you. And so all of our people showed up not knowing what was going to happen, and they divided them all up and had them go to work with individual members from the church for the day and just spend an entire day walking in their shoes, cooking food with them, helping their children, doing homework. And it was just connecting with their lives. And so when we asked them, what do you really, really want? They said, we don't want your money. We want a prayer partner. So we started doing like this sister church program where instead of just connecting missionary to missionary, which often happens between church leadership, actually connecting entire church families with church families internationally and letting them become prayer partners back and forth using platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, other just sort of communication tools and social media. So that instead of thinking institution, connecting institution to institution, rather connecting person to person And that seemed to create a lot of transformation for people and a deeper level of buy-in. And oh my gosh, like these people are so happy. I feel so compelled to give them money, but I feel like it would just be to release my own burden and not actually to help them or assist them. And it was very guilt-inducing. So yeah, we talk a lot about a movement away from charity to envy, and actually being honest in that we actually hold these people up in higher esteem than ourselves when it comes to what they know about the gospel. So I think it's just some of those personal contact things. It's not really a deeply programmatic type of approach, but I would love to see everybody in the Western Church just find somewhere where the Spirit's moving powerfully internationally and find one way to connect there, not in a one and done trip, and not in a missional touristic kind of way, but in a much more deep and enduring way that isn't financially based, that's relationally based.
It is interesting thinking about just the Western Church following. You mentioned institution versus relationship, and I do wonder. It does make you question if just culturally we've created a Christianity in the West where we've built it up around certain structures that culturally don't exist elsewhere, and so their churches are being built around different things just because of different cultural values or ways of living. Aaron, your words made me think of when I was in Nairobi with a Regent course a number of years ago, and the one church that we went to with this course, we were investigating, African theology and context. So we went to Nairobi to learn from them, but we went to this church, Nairobi Chapel, which is a huge church in Nairobi, and it's got 7 different sites in the city, but it was so Western.
Yeah.
It was so Western. And I had to wait till after the course before a couple other students and I could actually go check out like an indigenous church. But it was fascinating because I think the senior minister, if I remember correctly, was educated at Fuller down in the States. And it was just kind of mind-boggling. But I think we're kind of, in the last decade, what we've kind of seen is that that might be the norm, that might be an anomaly, but what it does seem, it seems that church leaders in other places are a little nervous about adopting Western practices and ideas because we don't exactly have anything to show for it anymore because of the decline in the West, as you were kind of speaking about. So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about that and that dynamic?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you brought that up. Like here in the US, right, for 20 some years now, every year we have 4 new non-believers for every 1 new Christian. We're at an incredibly opportunistic moment in COVID, right? Everybody's like, I just want normal again. I just want to go back. And I just want to shake everybody and be like, go back to what? Like it sucked. We were terrible at it. We were going backwards at 4 times the rate we were supposed to be going forward. What? Right? Like the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So why are we so eager for that? And what is it that our comforts are actually built in? And I think we just had these liturgical practices that were much more behaviorally based. They're sort of like our own little, kitty blanket that they're nostalgic to us. They feel good to us. But they're not actually life-giving. And they weren't actually born of the Spirit. They're much more born of creaturely comforts that I think that our churches felt more like walls for us than open doors to our community. As now we look forward to just learning from others. I went back, I'm scanning the commentaries on my shelf, right, that I've picked up over the years, all recommended to me by my fantastic profs at Regent that I loved. But man alive, almost every name in there is some old white dude, as opposed, I've had to go through and call part of my commentary library and purposefully go out and find out who are the leaders in the church in China, who are the leaders in the church in Africa. I need to be writing sermons in North American context, listening to international church leaders who are doing this in fresh and new ways. So I think that's one way I'm trying to incorporate that back into the way that I look and think about American context or North American context. Jenna, you hit too on the institutional piece. This is where I think our next generation is really, really helpful for us. We complain because they're so distrustful of institutions and have no institutional loyalty whatsoever. Well, there's a reason for that distrust, right? You grow up in a Me Too and a Church Too movement, and you'd be skeptical of those institutions and the people who lead them as well. So that's opportunity for renewal, and rebirth and recreation. And so I love it that this generation, that Gen Z, doesn't sort of swallow this stuff whole, but is very willing and excited to try to recreate that. So I think that creates a new moment, a new opportunity for us.
Well, imagine for a moment that you could get just tons of North American pastors to sit in a room, and the seminary class was taught by a number of your friends who have planted churches in Liberia and neighboring countries. What would they want to teach? And what would you want the pastors to learn? And not just pastors, but church leaders and people who are deeply committed and want to see the church in our own cities grow and thrive.
Good. I think they would want us very quickly to rethink what we mean by that word grow, and what we mean by thrive and be successful. I mean, one of the greatest African pastor teachings I've ever heard, is the measure of a great church is not by its seating capacity, but by its sending capacity. And we still define successful churches by which ones are the most established within our communities. In other words, who has the biggest building, who's got the biggest programs and the most staff. And so as much as we don't want to admit it, we are so products of our consumeristic culture. And so I think that they would be pushing us really, really hard to be thinking about, are you actually disciples who are making disciples? And not just your pastor, but like everybody in your church. And if you're not, I really don't care how big your budget is, and I don't care how many seats you have. Sending capacity, not seating capacity. That one, I think, is at the heart of a lot of their message.
Aaron, this just playing off of what you were just talking about, it just made me think, when we think of sending capacity, because I remember, again, the churches in Kenya were also about going deep and going wide. And it was sort of like these things were simultaneous, or things that you needed to constantly be thinking about simultaneously. You don't just go deep. And I think that's what a lot of, particularly in our tradition, a lot of churches are inclined to do, is try to go deep in discipleship. But the missiological aspect of it is missing, the actual doing something with that discipleship. Have you seen examples of discipleship in places like Liberia that look different than what we do for discipleship here, that incorporate that missional aspect? Like, how do they do discipleship differently? Sorry, that was a curveball question.
No, it was a really good one, because you totally stumped me. I'm trying to think how I would actually describe that. I mean, I think the easy tempting answer for me is to be like, well, they just seem to be all more in, right? Like, are their churches the center of their community, and they're there 3 to 4 times a week and not like 1 hour each week. And their relationships and their social networks are all born out of that place. But I really do think that it's more than that. I think that their discipleship has more to do with teaching people to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. And our Christianese about going deep typically means loving the Lord really, really well with all of our mind, and not our heart and soul and strength. And so it doesn't translate into service within our community. It doesn't translate into financial sacrifice. It doesn't translate into having your heart absolutely broken for someone down the street from you who's been hurt in life to the point they would actually upend your apple cart. And I just see them so closely tied to each other relationally that way, that's just worth figuring out together for them. We would do another book study. We would think more deeply about that. And I think particularly in our Reformed tradition, that's actually a little bit of an idol. I think we like to tell ourselves and give ourselves a pass, saying that's been our great contribution in Christian education or in Christian philosophy and thought and systematic theology. But I think we struggle from infobesity. We've got kids who grow up and they're full of knowledge, and then a crisis like this hits, and we finally realized that we've been spiritual couch potatoes for 30 years, and we don't have the spiritual muscles to actually endure hardship. We don't have a theology of suffering. We've railed against health and wealth gospel and prosperity notions, and yet every one of us operates out of a framework that our life is supposed to move up and to the right from the day we're born until the day we retire. And I think we've got a lot of deconstruction there, I think, to do.
Well, so, Aaron, keep going.
Yeah. No, so I was just going to say, in terms of discipleship, I think that's it. It is actually more comprehensive in the way that they view their lives, being just wrecked by Jesus. Like when people are afraid to become Christians because it's going to tear their life apart and not just, be 8 new steps to a better you. It's born out of an other directed view of what the Spirit is doing instead of something that's much more selfishly motivated.
So much of what
I love that. Yeah, I wrote that one down. Infobesity. Everyone, remember that one.
I did not make that up. I read that somewhere, but
that was a very cruel comment. I feel very hurt by that. I was very comfortable with my infobesity, Aaron. So much of what you just talked about is really matters of how the church relates to its culture, like this idea of like living out the gospel in a particular place, but not being taken hostage by it. I mean, and along the way, you've actually made a few comments that suggest quite clearly that there's a lot of ways in which the church in the West has been taken hostage very subtly and carefully over time by consumer culture. And maybe I can turn that around and say, how have you learned from the global South in terms of how the church relates faithfully and yet relevantly to its culture? And what can we learn in that posture that they have?
Yeah, I mean, the most poignant one for me is when we started getting to do these church plants in these new communities that were very, very rural, had never been touched by gospel before, were deep into animistic belief systems. They've been practicing polygamy for thousands of years. And so all of a sudden these polygamist households come to Christ, and all their church leaders were getting together trying to figure out what do we say to these people? Like, is the godly thing now to divorce 7 of your 8 wives and cut them all off? Or what is someone who is absolutely moved by Jesus to do in this situation? And it just felt like you were walking through like this Acts 15 moment where they all get together, and you're expecting this Jerusalem council to come up with this 176-page tome on, what to do about this and that theological issue. And when that passage concludes, the church leader's like, it seemed good to the Spirit and to us that you probably shouldn't sleep with hookers. Don't go to, eat meals at, foreign temples for different idols. And, they just have this little short list, and it just seemed obvious to them. And that's sort of what I saw the African church do in that, was walk out of a meeting together with all their leaders just saying, it seemed good to the Spirit and to us. And I'm like, I don't remember the last time I even saw that in minutes at my last council meeting, right? Like, we consider ourselves such great problem solvers that we're trying to do a lot of it without Christ, and without his Spirit in that. And so to just be completely much more wide open to maybe his next move is actually beyond my current peripheral vision. And it's not one of the 7 possibilities I came to the meeting with or drew out on the spreadsheet. Maybe he wants to blow our doors off and do something entirely new. And I think that they embrace that better. And I don't know if that's just the newness of gospel that over time, accumulates other things along the way that sort of hinder it, or if we're just tempted by different spirits in the Western church than the churches elsewhere are.
Can I pick up on that, Aaron? Because so I think I'm always intrigued, because when it comes to church plants and new church plants and creating a culture, so to speak, which is why so many church leaders are drawn to church plants, if they are drawn, not many are, but those who are drawn to church plants are so drawn to the idea of creating a culture rather than stepping into an already institutionalized one, because it's a lot easier to create one than to change one. But with a lot of these churches growing elsewhere, Is it just inevitable that at some point they'll also become institutionalized in some capacity? And how, and if not, what would keep them from falling into that trap?
That's good. I think it's tempting for us to just sort of say or give ourselves a pass by saying, well, I'm sure when they're far enough along, they'll do the same thing, right? Because we all have rules in our church order that all came about because there was a problem people couldn't solve, so we made a rule for it. But I actually don't think that's necessarily the case. I think there really is something in just the bare necessity of the gospel when you don't have a lot of other things along. I think the things that we've drug along have been multi-million-dollar facilities and huge staffing responsibilities, and a desire to want to put a checklist in front of people that we're doing bigger and better events, and we're doing this series and we're doing that. Whereas they're just simply financially not going to be burdened by some of the same weights that we are, because they can't afford the next Francis Chan video series that comes out, and they can't afford the next best-selling Christian self-help book that everybody's going to read at MOPS. Like, it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, poverty insulates against some of those trappings. Whereas I notice here, even myself, like, I work so hard to build my life that I don't need to have faith, right? That's sort of the Western model, is I just need to make sure I take care of every contingency so I won't have to trust God. But when you don't have life insurance and health insurance and all of these things, you are always going to stay in a place of give us today our daily bread, and mean it with every ounce of your being because it's real to you. Our wealth has been more threatening, I think, to our gospel than almost anything else. So that's actually what I think is, I don't think it's time and accumulating things like a snowball that's rolling, that's picking up momentum. I think it's wallets that have rolled that have picked up a lot of financial obligations.
Wow. That was a zinger, Aaron. I mean, that thread kind of wove its way through the beginning of what you shared too, how the poverty is a reality that shapes every dimension of the church's life in Liberia. That's just the context they live in and thrive in. In some ways, that should not surprise us for a second, given all the ways that Jesus talked about the margins receiving his blessing.
Yes.
I want to hear, I want you just to imagine this scenario. You come back to British Columbia, and you go back to the area of Fleetwood, and you are commissioned to plant a church. What would you do based on what you have learned from your brothers and sisters in the Global South?
I'd steal a bunch of sheep from Hope Community. No, because that's often been our church planting models, right? Is we just attract other Christians. I would really want to go back and just, like, who are the biggest people groups moving into this area? Who are the poorest people in these neighborhoods? What's the place where someone's the most receptive to hearing the gospel, right? Like, David, you hit on this, right? Like, this is the start of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Blessed are the, look down the list, right? We keep reading blessed like it means pitied. It doesn't. It means favored by God are all of these people because they're in difficult places. History has taught us that, I mean, if I put a map of the world in front of you right now, of all the places where Christianity is growing the fastest, it's everywhere where people are poorest, the most persecuted, and have the greatest need for a savior. So I would hope that this message that I've learned from this stuff has sunk deep enough in me that I wouldn't want to be drawn to the same trappings of, if you build it, they will come type of model, but rather just, where are the deepest felt needs of this community? What's the best news that could happen to this neighborhood that the church here isn't seeing yet? I'm hoping that would be it, but I also understand, like, that's a tough sell. That's a long walk to go on with people, and a very big ask.
Keep going. You can be more specific.
I honestly, I mean, I've been removed. I've been here for 16 years now. So, what the most pressing issues are in a Fleetwood neighborhood or in other parts of the Fraser Valley right now, I probably don't know as well as I did then. But I would really want to develop a core of people and walk through a period of time of teaching, just being able to look at how would this really be different, you know. Church plants also have a tendency to accumulate people who are just disgruntled elsewhere. So yeah, when you say it's easier to start something new, well, it is, because the one thing everybody's got in common is they don't like where they came from, and they got a gripe with somebody else. But then after, right, a few years, you're going to hit this hurdle where you realize, well, wait a second, we actually have to be for something here. So I don't know, I'd want to help people work through their hurts and what are you disgruntled by, and maybe you need to go back and make amends before you're actually in a place where you can create something new instead of just running from where you were.
Right.
Thanks.
Well, I
Can
do
go?
appreciate.
I want to go, Dave.
Oh yeah.
We don't have any listener questions. Aaron, you're just doing such a phenomenal job of articulating yourself. So I'm just going to selfishly ask, working with college students, have you found that this kind of a vision for understanding the gospel message and the growth of Christianity is easier for them to catch on to than, say, older generations? Or how have you found that dialoguing with college students?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, and part of that is a youthful naivete, but also just, you know, I mean, if you look at some of look at the Barna research stuff, the things that drive Gen Z even differently than Gen X or millennials, they really don't care as much about the same sort of trappings that sort of a builder and boomer generation did coming before. You know, the desire to build something doesn't exist in the same way. The longing for deep relationships after spending so much time in life in a digital world is very, very real. So I think just their value system is already set up better for that. And even if that's just simply reactionary, right? Like each generation pulls the pendulum back from where they were taken. Even if it's just of that, there are things within that are real positives, and that can be built off of. And I think set them up well in a lot of ways. I'm very optimistic, actually, about the future of the church because of the kids that I see coming through here, the 18 to 22-year-olds, you know, who can't reconcile this just like all-in calling to follow Jesus with some of the other elements of life and culture. And when they're just like, they feel the tug of war and they're like, forget it, I'm not even going to try, I'm all in. And I see that a lot. So that's really encouraging to me. So it feels like breaking the spell of the American dream.
I really appreciate that comment, Aaron, because I think older generations, including millennials, can be prone to disparaging, you know, Gen Z. It's the last letter in the alphabet, and it's always the never unplugged, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you for those words. I guess my comment is related to that. Like, my sense of what you shared at the very beginning is that a lot of church leaders and church planters in the global South are very risk-taking oriented. And you seem to indicate that there's a safety that sort of holds back some of what's happening in the Western church. What are the risks that need to be taken right now in Western churches? And that'll be my last question, Jenna, just so you know.
We'll finish with this one.
I got to have a great one-on-one Zoom conversation a few weeks ago with Albert Jew, and walked away from there thinking about several of these things. And he was sharing at the time just sort of the future of, you know, when people are at this moment not thinking about the future salvific moment, even existentially for our church's existence, isn't hold tighter, you know, it's successful churches plant churches. And so to actually be brave enough to go against the grain and not just hold on tighter, but send out faster. I mean, that feels like a huge risk, I think, to people, because they're like, we can barely pay our own bills. Why would we ever do that? But that's at the essence of the DNA of church and the community of Jesus that was founded. So I think recapturing a little bit of that spirit, that adventurousness for people, come on, that's way more compelling for a church congregation right now. Be like, are we going to plant a church in a neighborhood here that doesn't have a church? Or are we just going to guilt everybody into making sure we hit the budget next year? Like, which of those sounds more compelling to you to follow, right? Like, and the one feeds the other. I think it's just trusting the wisdom of Jesus. Like, he wasn't naive and he wasn't a simpleton. He was a genius. And I think he knows what moves the human heart. And it is, and it will always be completely oxymoronic that this kingdom grows the more you give it away. We just have to re-embrace that. But that is risky business. At least it feels like on the outset.
Yeah, it's a tough sell to many minds who feel worried about the future of the church and its decline in numbers. And I just really appreciate you sharing that.
Aaron, we did have just one quick listener question, so we'll close with this one. One listener is asking, so they're not in charge of a church, they're just a quote unquote regular attender. How do I begin in my little way to shift towards what you're talking about, to be a missionary in my own context? Does it mean I sell all my possessions? Does it have to be some sort of extreme thing?
I doubt it, because I wouldn't think you'd have to walk very far down your street before you found someone who needs something that Jesus offers. You know, in our own neighborhoods, I think it's just this, I really do think it's just the simple prayer of open my eyes to see where you're working. What's the next thing that you want to do on my block? What's the next thing you want to do under my roof? What's the next thing you want to do in my heart? Those are the most compelling things that people want to get on board with. And I think that can run like a contagious virus in a beautiful, beautiful way, through homes and through families and through neighborhoods. So I think it's just that, just God, show me, right? Like, what's the one thing today where I can be good news to somebody around me? If all of our churches had all of its members waking up every morning saying that prayer, I don't think we'd have budget issues.
Well, thanks for that, Aaron. All right, well, I think we'll close up there, try to keep it to under an hour again tonight. Thank you so much, all those of you who are joining with us this evening, and all those of you who will tune in afterwards. Don't forget to tune into, if you missed them, actually, don't forget to tune into and watch some of the two previous interviews that we did. Albert Chu was our first, and then last week we had interviewed Jim Mullins. And next week we have Shayla Visser. And so don't forget to tune into that. You can find all of the information on our Sent or on the Eventbrite page. Just search Sent Conference and you'll find the links there. A huge thank you to Aaron for joining with us this evening. Thank you so much for offering your time and your wisdom with us. Many blessings to you as you continue in ministry at Dordt University and beyond. And many blessings to all of you that are watching tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on too. Really appreciate it.